So very, very warm welcome from us to all of you. Thank you for coming on a Saturday afternoon. Thank you so much to David for joining us. This is the third in a series of webinars that we're organizing as the EcoDharma Network in the UK. And it's called EcoDharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Precipice. I'm Olivia Fuchs, I'm the coordinator of the EcoDharma Network. So David, thank you very much. He's also the author of a wonderful book, which I do recommend, called EcoDharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis. So thank you, and over to David. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you to Olivia and everyone else who's worked to make this possible, and to all of you for joining us in these critical times. Anyway, wow. What's that apocryphal Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times. This is certainly by far the most interesting time, interesting, I guess, in quotation marks, right? Interesting time in my life, and I'm not that young anymore. I'm reminded of a couple short Zen stories. In one of them, the student asked the master, what do we do when difficult times come? And the master replies, and it's kind of hard to show this online, kind of holds up his arms, welcome, welcome. And I think that's really important. Our practice is not about avoiding difficult times. And in fact, even more so, we can say that difficult times are often the best times for our practice, in the sense that, as we know, that's when the practice can go most deeply and be more transformative. And there's another little Zen story too, where in fact, this is a koan. Another student asks another master, what's the constant activity of all the bodhisattvas and mahasattvas? In other words, what is it that enlightened people are doing all the time? What's special about how they live in the world moment by moment, or certainly day by day? And the answer, quite revealing, it's also short and simple, responding appropriately, responding appropriately. Really important to keep this in mind. Our path isn't about somehow escaping or transcending this world. There are types of Buddhism, like in other traditions, where that's the focus. It's not about finding some sort of impregnable peace of mind or serenity where we're able to ignore the world. It's just the opposite. It's really about how do we respond appropriately, or in the present context, given the cascading crises that we're facing today, not just the climate emergency and the ecological crisis in general, but more recently the pandemic. Excuse me while I pull this back up here. The pandemic, and then everything that's gone along with it. Economic pause, if not beginning of a larger breakdown, and I think many of us sense we've entered into a period of kind of ecological crisis, and add to that, of course, sorry, not just ecological, I meant to say political crisis there, putting all that together with other issues like social injustice, especially in this country, racism. What do we do? How to respond to all that? And one of the really important things that's developed, I think, in the Buddhist world, although it's taken us a while, is what's being called EcoDharma. Some people have thought that I term the term or name the term, but in fact, as far as I know, it was first used by the Triratna teacher Guyapati, who has started this EcoDharma Center in Northeast Spain, which I've been fortunate to be able to visit, and I indeed recommend it. They're doing truly incredible things there. But this whole larger question of what is it that Buddhism has to offer, this new type of Buddhism that we now talk about. Obviously, when we go back to traditional Buddhism, right? I mean, it's like, this wasn't the kind of problem, ecological, or even the kinds of specific economic and political challenges that we face today. These weren't the kind of problems that the Buddha had to face. It's not as though we're going to be able to read off appropriate responses by going back to the Pali Canon or Mahayana Sutras. Nonetheless, you know, there are sort of very important implications within the traditional Buddhist teachings that I think can be teased out. One of them in particular that's really fascinating to me is what seems to me a quite striking parallel, precise and profound parallel, I would say, between what I think Buddhism has always been saying about an individual predicament, and parallel between that and our collective situation today, in terms of our now global civilization in relationship to the rest of the biosphere. What I'm trying to point out here is that just as I think the fundamental problem that Buddhism is talking about is the sense of separation, the sense that there's a separate me, maybe inside here and the rest of the world is outside, and that that's connected with dukkha or suffering, dissatisfaction, and that our path is about, as Dogen would say, forgetting ourselves, letting go of our sense of separate self, and realizing our non-duality with the world. So it seems to me, when we look at the roots, the larger roots of the ecological crisis, I think it comes down to something much the same, that we as a species, now global species, global civilization, we have this sense of separation to the earth, which is why we feel that we can use and abuse it in any way we like, because somehow our well-being is separate from the rest of the biosphere. And it always strikes me as a really remarkable case of sort of karma, very clear case of karma, that, you know, as we relate to the earth, it's going to bounce back to us. What we do to the earth is going to affect us for the simple reason that we are not separate from it. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting things to say there, but what I want to focus on today is something else, which I think is probably the most important teaching of Buddhism in relationship to our present situation. And it's what I would call the new bodhisattva or the ecosattva path. And what I really like to do is focus on three aspects of that. The first aspect is the idea of a double practice, right? That is to say, bodhisattvas, ecosattvas continue to work on their own personal transformation through their meditation or whatever, but they know that that's insufficient, that they also know that it's important to become engaged in the world. We need to pursue our own awakening, but that's not enough. We need to be out there. It's not just about helping others, but because at a fundamental depth here, our realization involves that we're not separate from others, that others are not other, and therefore, how can we not be concerned about what's going on in the world in general? In other words, I think we can say that the two practices need each other. I'm reminded of something Franz Kafka wrote in a letter. He said, "You can hold yourself back from the suffering of the world. That's something you are free to do. But perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering that you could avoid." And that seems to me really profound. Huh? Let me say it again. You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world, but perhaps your holding back is the one suffering you could avoid. This reminds me of another favorite quotation by actually he's not a Buddhist, the Neo-Vedantin Nisargadatta, who I think points at why this is true. There's different translations, different versions of this, but basically Nisargadatta says, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows." Beautiful. A beautiful description of the two pillars of the Buddhist path, right? Wisdom and love, or as we usually say it, wisdom and compassion. And what this really points to here is this insight that what we call love or compassion, it's actually something that flows naturally from the inside. You know, the realization that I'm not separate from you and that we are not separate from the rest of the world implies a different way of relating to the world. Instead of the usual question, you know, what's in it for me? A question we also can ask spiritually, you know, what's in it for me, my own spiritual development. Instead of that, it invites us to open up and ask this larger question of, you know, what can I do to make the world a better place for all of us, right? I mean, it seems to me that we usually start the path because, I mean, if you think about all the hassles involved in terms of all the time, the energy, the money, you know, sitting on our butts, facing the wall, whatever, um, why would we do this? And the usual answer is that because there's some dissatisfaction, there's something not right in our lives. Our lives aren't as good as we think they should be. And it might be some kind of physical, mental, psychological pain. It might simply be a kind of existential, what's it all about, who am I? But nonetheless, I think in almost every case, you know, we're motivated at some individual level to sort of make this effort and to get into this path. But the danger is that in the long run, this can reinforce the fundamental kind of self-preoccupation that, according to Buddhism, is really, I think, at the heart of the issue. So even though we start with this focus of, you know, transforming ourselves, I think what we eventually come to realize, if the path is working well for us, is that at the root, ultimately, at the root of our dukkha is this sense of self-preoccupation, self-concern. I think that many of us too still have a kind of romanticized idea about the path. You know, maybe somebody like Milarepa, there's the story. He was somebody who lived in a cave by himself, ate green nettles, so his skin turned green, and sort of went all the way to Buddhahood in one lifetime. That's the way it's often described. And, you know, it's only after that, then he goes out and he does some, you know, some teaching. He has students and so forth. I think there's a kind of a romanticized notion here that we often tend to buy into. You know, it's like, if I can just focus on my own awakening, and then, you know, when I'm fully awakened, then maybe I'll come out and I'll be engaged with other people. And I think there's a real misunderstanding there that Joanna Macy puts her finger on, right? The world has a role to play in our awakening. I remember back in the days when I started Zen practice in Hawaii, in the Maui Zendo, and, you know, we were sitting pretty hard. It wasn't, frankly, that difficult. Insights, little openings happened a lot. What I found much more difficult was actually going out and integrating what seemed to be happening, what I was learning in the practice, in the meditation, with how I actually related to other people. And that's what was really so transformative. So what all this points to, basically, is the idea that whereas many of us, I think, still have the idea of engagement in the world as somehow a fundamental distraction from the basic practice, I think what we need to move toward is this realization that engagement in the world is just as important a part of our practice as anything that's going on our meditation cushions. Ram Dass used to talk about this double process as a kind of self-sharpening tool. You know, things would happen in meditation, and then we go out and we'd see where we were still stuck in some way, where whatever we had realized wasn't really transforming yet our pretty deep-rooted, basically self-preoccupied, habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting. Isn't there the Zen saying, if you think you're enlightened, well, go spend the holidays with your family. We'll find out. So basically, I think you can see what I'm getting at here. The idea is that the problems are not engagement in the world. We shouldn't think about that as a distraction from the fundamental issue, but that what we really need now is this deeper understanding of practice as having two sides, and that our engagement in the world is indeed an essential part of our practice. In fact, we could even say that the person who benefits most from the activity of the bodhisattva in the world is the bodhisattva herself or himself, because that's part of our own individual transformation, right? Bob Thurman used to say sometimes, people are always talking about practice, practice. What I want to know is, when is the performance? And I think what we're realizing is that the performance is part of the practice too, right? So that's the first point. Basically, this double practice. And I think that's always been implicit in the idea of the Bodhisattva path. But what I want to go into, I think, is now something a little bit maybe not so obvious. And this is the second point that I would like to make. The idea of the Bodhisattva path being new in the sense that I think we now have a different and a deeper, more profound understanding of dukkha, right? The word usually translated as suffering, right? The suffering that the Bodhisattva is committed to alleviate. I think we have a deeper sense of where that comes from and how it is, or what it is that we need to do in order to alleviate. When we go back to the Pali Canon, the original teachings, as close as we have them, I really sense that the Buddha was a lot more progressive than the organization that developed after he died. I mean, if you look at his attitude toward women, the way that he started this Bhikkhuni Sangha, based on the realization women have the same basic nature, the same possibility, potential to awaken as men. Something we take for granted today, but it was pretty major in his time. And likewise, his attitude toward caste, the way that when people joined the Sangha, they lost all caste. Also very profound, I think. But then, the way that kind of social edge, the way that the Buddha realized, and this is pretty clear in one of the early sutras, like the Aganya Sutra, the way the Buddha realized that, the way society is structured in contemporary terms, what he's saying in that sutra is that it's a social construction. It's not as though we're different parts of Brahman's body or something like that, but it's like an agreement among humans. And therefore, I think he saw this, he had a lot of insight into, the equality, the racism, the caste, the misogyny, and the gender issues of his time. But what happened after he died, frankly, I think the organization became a lot less progressive. And in particular, I think this has affected our understanding of karma and the idea that somehow all the suffering in my life is due to what I've done in a past lifetime or maybe earlier in this lifetime. And I think that focus on the individual level has become very problematical. For one thing, we can see how it can rationalize sort of social problems. I'm thinking here particularly of a Tibetan teacher I once heard say, "Oh, what terrible karma all of those Jews in Nazi Germany, Nazi Europe must have had in order to be born in that place at that time." And I find that attitude just totally unacceptable. I think we know too much more about how institutions work and how people, you might be the nicest person in the world, but if you get caught up in that, it can be very, very destructive. What I'm trying to point at here is, I think, whereas the Buddha, he didn't talk about evil, he talked about the three poisons: greed, ill will, delusion is how I translate them. And I think the big thing we can see today is that the three poisons aren't simply something that operate on an individual level, but in fact, that they have become institutionalized, and that therefore we need to address them not only individually. And to be a bodhisattva or ecosattva, it's not just about helping individuals, it's about trying to understand the institutions and how it is that they might be addressed, right? I'm reminded here of Bill McKibben. when he was in Paris for the climate talks, he said, he was asked by a woman, what can I do as an individual? And he replied, stop being an individual. And I think that's a challenge to all of us Buddhists as well, that so often we tend to think on the individual level. And indeed, I would say this is one of the real problems in sort of Western Buddhism, the way that it has sort of plugged into sort of Western individualism. And, you know, we have lots of Buddha, we have lots of Dharma, but I think we're fairly weak on Sangha. And I really appreciate, you know, this organization that's invited me to give this talk. I think these are exactly the kinds of working together that we need to do. I think what I'm noticing in the US at least is that over the last generation, I think we've become a lot better at, you might say, pulling drowning people out of the river, in the sense that, again, individuals helping other individuals, maybe homeless shelters or hospice work or prison dharma, and all of that extremely important. But nonetheless, I think we still have a real problem addressing things at the institutional level. To go back to that analogy of pulling individuals out of the river, I don't think we're much better in asking, you know, why it is that there are so many more people drowning in the river. Who is it or what is it that's pushing them in the water upstream? And I think we've got to start addressing that. To come back to these three roots of evil, three fires, can be understood different ways. Greed, ill will, delusion. Well, it really seems to me, and I think it's becoming more obvious, that we've institutionalized greed, that if greed means you never have enough, that's one definition. It seems to me that that's a pretty good description of our economic system, right? Corporate consumer capitalism, where it's not only individuals that don't have enough, you know, we don't consume enough, we're encouraged by advertising always to want more, but also corporations, never profitable enough, their market share never big enough, their stock price never big enough, collective GNP never big enough. This sort of need to grow, that somehow the idea of progress is indefinite growth, which I think is at the heart of the ecological crisis. But it also raises this question, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? And again, I think this really touches on the role of greed, which we can't understand simply in an individual level, but how that's institutionalized, how a CEO, even if he or she sort of woke up in the Buddhist sense and realized they had to change what they were doing, what the company was doing, fossil fuel, for example, they might wake up, but nonetheless, if they don't play along, if what they do, if the changes that they want to make might affect corporate profits, they're in danger of losing their job, right? So that's what I mean by institutionalization here. I think another example of institutionalization of ill will would be, certainly here in the US, our militarism. We could look at our attitude toward inmates in prisons or immigrants, refugees, but maybe the best example is, well, again, we could talk about institutionalized racism, but what I'm thinking right now in particular is militarism. You know, if it's measured by the amount of resources that we put into it, the US is by far the most militarized society in human history. And then you get into the problem that if you're going to spend that much money on the military, well, you've got to use it once in a while, right? You've got to find somebody to drop bombs on or invade. So I think all of those are examples of institutionalized ill will. And then institutionalized delusion. Well, I know that you in the UK have pretty much the same problem we do here, in the sense that most of the media are private corporations and basically run, controlled by billionaires. And they're primarily concerned about profit. They're primarily concerned about finding ways to sort of grab our eyeballs and sell them to the highest bidder, which is to say advertising, and how that reinforces consumerism and a certain view of the world. So I think that is a very important aspect of what we might call institutionalized delusion, the way that the media, which have now become our national and sort of international nervous system, perpetuate a certain understanding of the world that has indeed become very, very problematical. Anyway, hopefully you can see what I'm getting at here, that whereas traditional Buddhism, the traditional Bodhisattva path, is all about individuals helping other individuals, I think we're clearly in a situation where we need to understand the institutionalization of the problems that we're facing today. So that's one sense in which the Bodhisattva path that we need today, I think, needs to develop. We have different and I think deeper understandings of how dukkha, of how the three poisons can be built into organizations. Yeah. So that's the second point. The third point is basically pretty simple, the idea that, and it makes sense given what I've already said, right? It's like, if we want to be eco-sattvas, if we want to be new bodhisattvas, Buddhism today can't tell us what to do, given that our situation is quite distinctive, quite unique, but it has a lot to say about how to do it. And here, there's a lot of things that one could talk about. I mean, traditionally, we have, for example, the six paramitas, the six perfections, character traits that we are encouraged to develop to the highest possible degree, generosity, ethical behavior, endurance, patience, persistence, some kind of mindfulness, and of course, prajna, wisdom, especially. Those are the kind of six classical ones. And there's a lot of other things that one could talk about as well. But I really want to focus on the one that for me stands out and really, yeah, I'll finish just by talking about that. Because for me, it gets at what's most distinctive and powerful about spiritual activism, not just Buddhist activism, but I think any activism that's grounded in some kind of spiritual practice. And it's simply this, that bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of action. Let me say that again. Bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of what they do. If you go back to the Pali Canon, one of the things that the Buddha said, one of the characteristics of an awakened person is that what they do is nirasa, which can be translated without expectation, or even sometimes without hope. And you find the same point made, for example, in later traditions, like in Tibet, the Lojong tradition. One of the aphorisms makes the point, quote, abandon any hope of fruition. Don't get caught up in how you're going to be in the future. Stay in the present moment. Really important. And you find this not only in Buddhism, but for example, in other traditions. I'm thinking especially of the Bhagavad Gita, which offers several different sort of paths to God. And one of them is karma yoga, the yoga of action. But the most important thing about that action, again, is that it's non-attached to the result. As it says, quote, your right is to the work, never to the fruits. Be neither motivated by the fruits of action nor inclined to give up action. The problem, though, is that acting without attachment to the result, I think, is very easily misunderstood to imply a kind of casual attitude. You know, especially this fits in with Buddhist emphasis on motivation or intention. And we might think what's really important is my motivation, not whether it has any real results. And I think that's very, very dangerous. We need to be as strategic as possible, or nothing is going to get done. But nonetheless, this teaching is important, and it goes quite a bit deeper than that. And so what I'd like to finish with is just talking a little bit about what that involves. 3 quick points, right? One of them is starting with the difference between running a 100-meter dash and a marathon, right? Like when you're running a 100-meter dash, the only thing that matters is getting to the other end as quickly as possible, right? You don't have time to think about anything else, but if you run a marathon that way, it's simply, you're going to burn yourself out really quickly, right? Instead, the idea is to run in a certain direction without fixating on the goal. That is to say, the finish line at the end of 26 plus miles, right? If you run in the right direction, you will eventually get there, but you don't need to be thinking about that at the time. And indeed, it can be problematical thinking about it. When I think about my friends who run marathons, they emphasize the importance of just this moment, just this moment, just this step, right? In Japanese, there's a term for it, tada, just this. And indeed, well, earlier Buddhism, the idea of tatha, just this. The Buddha is Tathagata, one who just comes, one who just goes. That it's really important to focus on this moment here and there and not to get sort of caught up in the goal. Again, we're moving in a certain direction. You're not sitting by the side of the road. You're going in that direction, but you're not focused on the goal. You are becoming one with the means, as it were. Right? That's the first point. But the second point, supposing there is a race, though, that doesn't have an endpoint, right? With a task so difficult that there's no end to it, that there's no final realization. I think what I'm trying to point here is basically the 4 bodhisattva vows that are so important in the Zen tradition. Saving, it's like, okay, the first one, sentient beings, living beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Wow. If you really think about that, we are vowing to fulfill an unfulfillable vow. I mean, is that weird or what? If we really understand what this commitment involves, can we avoid feeling overwhelmed? But here's the point. The fact that the vow cannot be fulfilled isn't the problem, it's the point of it. Since it can't be achieved, what the vow is really calling for is a reorientation in the meaning of our lives. From our usual self-preoccupation, what's in it for me, to turning around this question, what's good for the well-being of everyone, again, based on this realization that my own well-being is not separate from the well-being of everyone, because we're not separate from each other. So on a day-to-day level, what becomes important is not the unattainable goal, but the direction of our efforts. What does this imply about how we respond to the ecological crisis? Someone who has volunteered for a job that's literally impossible to do, impossible to fulfill, is not going to be intimidated by challenges that appear hopeless. I think that's really important. It's like, no matter how momentous the challenge facing us today, in a way, that's a kind of a small subset of what the Bodhisattva, what they have committed themselves to doing. No matter what happens, the idea here is that we're not discouraged, or maybe we are, but we don't get stuck there. We dust ourselves off. Meditation helps us let go of that, and then we get on with it. Because again, this vow goes beyond attachment to any particular accomplishment. When our efforts are successful, it's time to move on to the next thing. If they're not successful, we pick ourselves up, continue, or maybe we decide maybe that's not the way to do it. We change our approach. But the point is, we keep trying indefinitely. Once we realize our non-duality with other people and with this magnificent planet that takes care of all of us, we don't want to do anything else. It becomes both our passion and our joy to live this way. Or ask yourself, given the way things are falling apart now, given the fact that, ironically, just as we've achieved a truly global civilization that now seems to be self-destructing, that we can't in any way assume that the kind of life we've been able to live up to this point is going to be able to continue. Asking yourself in that larger context, okay, what do you want the meaning of your life to be? What's the focus going to be given the chaos that we seem to be entering into? But there's more, and this is the third point, and to me, the most important and the most interesting, the one that stands out the most, because let's be honest, and I think many of you are all aware of this, our ecological situation, even if you want to separate that from the economic and the social justice and the pandemic and so forth, our ecological situation does not look good, right? There's the very real possibility that anything we might do to address that might be in vain. And certainly it's the case that there are scientists who, not always publicly, but are becoming very pessimistic that we are very close to tipping points or may have passed them. And it may very well be that at this point, nothing we do, I mean, we don't know whether at this point it's going to be possible to sort of keep civilization, social order of the way that we're familiar with, or even if this might even be a challenge to the very survival of the human species, given the temperature changes that may actually happen. I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen, but this is a very real danger. The point is, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know. Sound familiar? Any Zen students out there? Don't know mind? I mean, often not knowing can be experienced in a very sort of enervating way, you know, loss of motivation. But I think within the Zen world, within the Buddhist world, I think, or let's just say within the Bodhisattva world, I think it's really just the opposite, right? In Zen, we cultivate don't know mind, which is the first of the 3 Zen peacemaker precepts, the other 2 being bearing witness to the joys and sufferings of the world, and then taking actions that arise from that not knowing and bearing witness, right? One of my Zen teachers in Hawaii, Robert Aiken, used to say, our task isn't to clear up the mystery, but to make the mystery clear, right? And the mystery is very much a part of that don't know, or at the heart, at the core of that don't know. Our spiritual path isn't about sort of having an experience where now we understand everything and what's going on and what's possible, what's happening. In a way, it's kind of the opposite, where we open up to experience a sacred and mysterious world where actually we don't know. Bodhisattvas access this mystery not by grasping it, but being taken by it. And that's why we end up manifesting something greater than our own egos. So what I'm trying to say is that for those of us on the Bodhisattva path, this awesome mystery is not debilitating, but it's empowering. It can liberate us from dogmatism and other fixed ideas. We do the best we can in response to the best we know, although we never know for sure what's happening or what's possible, right? I mean, just think about it. I grew up during the Cold War, right? This standoff between the US and the Soviet Union, or the West and the communist bloc, and the fear of nuclear war resulting from somebody pressing a button. And then one day, it really seemed like a day, the whole thing collapsed almost overnight. And the same thing with apartheid in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela, one day he's on an island prison, the next day he's released, the next day it seemed like suddenly he's president of the new South Africa, right? It's like, we don't really know, and we need to cultivate that. We need to accept it in a way that doesn't distract us, doesn't keep us from doing our best, but it's in that larger context of mystery, right? I'm not talking here, and I think this is really important to emphasize, I'm not talking here about optimism or pessimism for that matter. I think optimism, pessimism is a very good example of kind of dualistic thinking. I'm reminded of my favorite definition of a pessimist, someone who has had to live with an optimist, right? You know, the way that those two can sort of reinforce each other. And the same thing is true, I think, with hope and fear, or maybe even hope and despair. They're a duality. If what you do is motivated by hope, it means what you do is going to be dogged or shadowed by the possibility of despair. And what I'm trying to point to here is something beyond that. I don't think it's hope and despair that motivates bodhisattvas. It's something deeper, right? Sam Smith, one of my favorite US journalists, said, despair is suicide of the imagination. And that's definitely not what we need. Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, he redefined hope by saying, hope isn't the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing regardless of how it turns out. And Wendell Berry, an American writer, said, we don't have the right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it? And I don't know if we have any Lord of the Rings fans here, but Tolkien, somewhere in the Lord of the Rings, he has Frodo asking Gandalf, I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that's not for them to decide. That is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. But I'm also reminded of Joanna Macy, who says she wouldn't miss this time for the world. This is the greatest time to be a practitioner, the greatest challenge. This is when what we have to offer is needed more than ever before. And it is sort of pushing us into the bodhisattva path. So who's right? Who's right? Gandalf, Joanna Macy, are they both right in some way? Anyway, to cut to the chase, I think all this points to the deepest meaning of non-attachment to results, and it's simply this. Our task is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do will make any difference whatsoever. We are called upon to do the best we can, not knowing what the consequences will be. Have we already passed ecological tipping points and civilization? Maybe our species is doomed? We don't know. And that's okay. Of course, we hope our efforts will bear fruit. As I said before, we do try to be strategic, but ultimately, what we do, our ecological efforts, are our gift to the earth, our gift to our mother, if you will. And, you know, like any genuine gift, it's given freely. If you give a gift because you expect something in return, that's not a gift. A real gift to the earth is it's given openly with non-attachment to results. We don't know if what we do is important, but it seems to be very important for us to do it. Again, this is not only distinctively Buddhist. I'm thinking of Rabbi Tarfon in the Jewish Mishnah, this famous line, don't be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Act justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. It's not your responsibility to finish the work here of Tikkun Olam, right? Saving or healing the world. It's not your responsibility to finish that work, but you are not free to desist from it either, right? And of course, this kind of activity, I think, is really, really difficult to do unless one has some kind of grounding and some kind of spiritual practice. And I think that's really pointing to why those two sides of practice go together, personal transformation, social transformation, why it is that each needs the other. If you're going to avoid the kind of burnout and frustration and anger that so often happens to social activists, or at least not get stuck there, it's so important to be grounded in some kind of contemplative practice, right? Of course, to be totally unattached, I think, is to set the bar really high, and maybe none of us can achieve that. But the point is, through our practice, when we do become frustrated because we are attached to the results, then we are able to return to the meditation, whatever our contemplative practice may be, and through that, then let go of the results and thereby be able to return to the fray. Our job isn't to be perfect, but to do the best we can. And to be frank, to conclude, it seems to me that if contemporary Buddhists don't want to do this or can't do this, then really maybe Buddhism isn't what the world needs right now. But what I've been trying to say is I think there's a lot within the Buddhist tradition, most importantly, this concept of the Bodhisattva path, that can actually help us understand and respond appropriately to, frankly, what I think is the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. The greatest challenge to our practice, the greatest impetus for all of us to do everything we can to wake up in order to respond appropriately. And I think I'm going to stop there. There's always more to say, but maybe that's enough for today. Thank you very much.